for this session we have David Dufty, who's going to talk about Central Bureau, Australia versus Bletchley Park, which would be very interesting. And then we have also Ethan Devereux who's going to talk about the exhibition and its preparation. So will you come down here, please, both of you? So David is coming up now. David, Bletchley Park, I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say.
All right, terrific. Okay. So my talk is about Central Bureau, which is sometimes dubbed the Australian version of Bletchley Park. So the reason I'm here today is because I wrote a book some years ago that came out in 2017 called The Secret Codebreakers of Central Bureau, How Australia's Signals Intelligence Network Helped Win the Pacific War. So, and the reason I mentioned Bletchley Park in the title is because most people have heard of Bletchley Park and the astounding achievements of the codebreakers there, led most notably Alan Turing, but others as well, other brilliant codebreakers. But I first want to go, but I'm not going to be talking about Bletchley Park, at least not much. This is going to be about what happened in Australia with codebreaking, which is much less known. So this is a picture of the invasion of Crete early in the war, and the reason this is important is because there was a signals team, an Australian signals team called 4 Special Wireless Section on the island, delivering intelligence to the commander of the Australian and New Zealand forces there during the Battle of Crete, which the Allies lost and the Germans took control. So here are 3 men who were in that team. Now the reason this is important is because 4 Special Wireless Unit was the only Australian active unit involved in signals intelligence or code breaking of any kind. Now the reason 2 of these pictures, and these pictures won't mean anything to you because none of these people are famous, but they mean a lot to me, and the reason 2 of the pictures are kind of not very high quality is because they're so not famous that the only photographs I could find were from their personnel records in the National Archives.
Oh, right.
So the first is a guy called Nick Sanford, who was actually trained by the Government School and Government Coded Cyber School, British, colloquially known as Bletchley Park. Jack Ryan, who was nicknamed the Skipper or sometimes Uncle Jack, and Stan Clark, known as Paddy Clark due to his prematurely grey hair. These guys, they're not the only interesting characters from 4 Special Wireless Unit, but they were of particular interest to me. They were camped on a water tank, in a water tank at the top of Crete, on top of a hill, delivering messages to the commanders below, and they were actually intercepting German messages, decrypting them and passing on the intelligence, as well as passing on information from Bletchley Park about intelligence matters from decrypts. Because, as you may know, Alan Turing and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had cracked the famous German Enigma cipher only a short time before, and so they were now reading German high-level messages, the highest level of German messages encrypted with these machines. The messages were being decrypted in England and disseminated. But this story is not about Crete. It's about Australia, because after the war broke out in the Pacific, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and Hong Kong and Singapore and captured Hong Kong and Singapore and other places in Southeast Asia, America entered the war, and Australian troops abroad were withdrawn, including 4 Special Wireless Unit, which then became the sort of the start, really, of Australian signals intelligence. They formed in Melbourne. This is a house in Brisbane at 21 Henry Street, Ascot. So after MacArthur came to Australia, he wanted his own signals intelligence. And when I say signals, okay, I need to clarify what I mean by signals intelligence. I'm not saying code breaking, because it's not just about code breaking. There are other aspects of cryptanalysis and cryptography other than code breaking. That's the most famous aspect of it, the most well-known word for it, but there are other things you can do. You can, for instance, you don't actually have to know what the enemy messages say. You can simply study the patterns of those messages. You can study the ebb and flow of messages on distant shores or distant lands or behind enemy lines to see where enemy troops are moving to and what they're planning. And especially if you can figure out, not necessarily what the message says, the message might be indecipherable to you, but even if you know who it was sent from and who it was sent to. And so what Central Bureau did, I should tell you a bit more about how they were formed in a minute. What they got very good at is doing that, which is known as traffic analysis, or was then. So when MacArthur came to Australia, this was one of the first things he wanted to do. He wanted his own intelligence operation, his own code-breaking operation. And it was formed, the two were formed. One was, and they were both joint US-Australia operations. Nominally, Central Bureau also included Britain, but it was really just US-Australian personnel, about 50-50. And the second one was, so there were two. There was a Navy one, and then there was everything else. The Navy one was formed to attack what was known as JN25, which was the Japanese highest level code. And Central Bureau, which formed in Melbourne in early 1942, but everywhere that MacArthur went, he wanted Central Bureau to be near him. So when MacArthur moved to Brisbane in mid-1942, Central Bureau moved to Brisbane. And then when he moved to Hollandia, Central Bureau sent a forward echelon to Hollandia. And when he moved to the Philippines, so did Central Bureau. They were formed from personnel from 4 Special Wireless Section, plus Australia's only codebreaker, a guy called Eric Nave, who was in the Navy, and American personnel, plus some experts who fled Singapore at the fall of Singapore. It was really a motley group, a small group. As they expanded over time, they had unorthodox recruitment methods. They just put out the word to try and find smart young guys in the Army or from the Air Force, from wherever they could find. They also got some university professors, mathematics professors involved, who had been studying codes in their spare time as a hobby. And they set up shop at this very old house in Ascot, and they outgrew it. So from this small start, by the end of the war, Central Bureau and its related field operations was 4,000 strong. And it was top secret. Nobody really knew about it. And in fact, they weren't allowed to talk about it. Everybody who worked here signed a document saying they would never speak about it for the rest of their lives. And in fact, when the veil of secrecy was lifted some decades later, and they were told, well, yes, you can speak about it, some of them did, and some of them spoke to me. I was lucky enough to write my book about it, when many of these guys were still alive, and women were still alive. But some said, no, at the start of the war, I signed a document promising I would never speak about it, and I'm going to keep that promise. Oh, but you can speak about it now. They said, I promised I wouldn't. So they didn't. They didn't. They had trouble with Anzac Day marches and parades because they actually couldn't talk about what they'd done or what unit they'd been in. And Central Bureau had its own command structure, reporting straight to the tops, reporting basically straight to MacArthur. So it was thankless work, actually. And one of the things they were doing was they were sending out field units because, okay, to clarify, the Navy codebreakers stayed in Melbourne. The Army and Air Force combined US-Australian operation it moved to Brisbane. The Navy didn't really need field operations as such because Navy messages on the radio are broadcast across the ocean. They very, very long distances, so they could simply set up large receiving antennae in Australia, listen to the Japanese messages, and put the experts to work trying to figure out what those messages said. The Army and the Air Force are a different matter because they don't necessarily broadcast over very long distances, and so Central Bureau needed teams as close as possible to the enemy to listen in, to actually even listen to the messages. And so there were teams, firstly just in northern Australia, but then in the jungles of Papua New Guinea and far-flung Pacific islands, and they'd set up with antennas and they'd sit there in tents 24 hours a day, around the clock, in shifts, with headphones on, listening to and transcribing Morse code. And the worst thing was, it wasn't even Morse code. Some of them were pretty good Morse code operators. It was the Japanese, because the Japanese alphabet is different. The Japanese had invented their own Morse code, which the Aussies called Kana code. So they had to learn this. So they were transcribing enciphered messages in a foreign language in an idiosyncratic version of Morse code. So these transcriptions they were making meant absolutely nothing. And so you can imagine this was grueling, tedious, terrible work. And writing them down on bits of paper, bundling them into bags, and these bags would be flown in secret to the airfields in Brisbane, where they would be unloaded and taken to Ascot, where the code breakers would get to work. And that continued throughout the war. And so these, as I said, these field operations grew and grew because the hunger for these messages from the top brass was pretty much insatiable. So what are they? This is just an example of what's known as a 3-figure code from the Japanese. I got this from the National Archives, and so it's just a string of numbers. And so the reason it's in a string of numbers is because the Japanese would encode they had a code book, and all the words would have well, in this particular code, a 3-digit number, which the beautiful thing, the clever thing about encoding using a code book that has numbers is you can then, like, if you have a code book and you have the codes are another word or something, that's one thing. But once you encode words as numbers, you can then do arithmetical operations to them to further encrypt them. And so you get these layers upon layers of encryption, and so which makes it really hard to crack. So this is an Enigma machine, and they were not dealing with. Thank you for the water. They were not dealing with Enigma. So the Japanese. By the way, the Allies had equivalents of this too. This kind of technology that Enigma was running on, that the British broke. All the major powers were using this stuff, this technology, and it was believed to be unbreakable at the start of the war. It's just that the Bletchley Park and the Americans actually thought, yeah, we think it's unbreakable, maybe, but let's have a go anyway. So the Germans took the sort of advice of the experts that these things could not be broken and continued to use them throughout the war. Germans had Enigma. The Japanese had a machine called Purple, which the Americans broke. The Commonwealth countries such as Australia and England were using a machine called the Type X, and the Americans had their own as well. So everyone was using this technology. The Japanese didn't make as much use of it. It wasn't actually, breaking Purple didn't help as much in the Pacific War as breaking Enigma helped, because the Pacific War was so spread out, and their machines were big and clunky, and you've got to ship them and then around the place. They were not portable, basically. So essentially, these code book systems were actually the main game. This is Eric Nave, as I said. He enlisted for the First World War in Australia, but then continued on in the Navy. He found out that if he studied Japanese, then the Navy was going to pay him an extra shilling a week. So he did that, and he became Australia's foremost really expert on Japanese, and then he got trained by the British in code breaking. These are some of the women that worked there, including Helen Kenny, Judy Rowe, who was a mathematical student of Professor Roon, who came up and studied here from Sydney. Not studied, he worked as a code breaker actually. This is a different kind of code again. This is the a Japanese. So the Central Bureau was in charge of Air Force codes. This is one of the Air Force codes. It's called tactical codes. There's different levels of codes in the military. Some codes you don't want to have ever broken, right? Some codes you can't have every field unit using an Enigma machine or a Type-X machine or these high-level, really complicated things because it's just too hard. So you have simpler codes as well that may be breakable, but it might take a couple of weeks to break them before you change your code books, in which case it doesn't matter. The battle's moved on, the air raid's over, whatever. You don't care if they break the message 2 weeks later because there's a new codebook issue. This is one of those. This was a tactical code that Eric Nave broke. The idea is the Japanese Air Force operator would write the message across and then read the message of the syllables down. So that's how that worked. And once you had this sort of crossword puzzle figured out, you could decrypt all of the messages. So this is so here we have a picture of sort of southeast, so basically Eastern New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific Islands. So one of the I'll tell you, I don't know, you haven't shown me a sign yet, have you? No, okay. So what makes this interesting is finding out how it actually made a difference, and it did make a difference in a few ways. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. One is 5 minutes. Oh, there's not 5 minutes sign. Okay. So one is the shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief of the Navy. So now look, an American squadron took him out. It was Americans that put their lives on the line to do it, and it was Americans that made the decision. So, you know, they have to be. When I say that Australians were involved in this, I'm not trying to take any credit away from the US forces that did it, but the original message was actually. It was sent in this very high-level JM25 code. There was a new code book, so they couldn't read it properly. But because Yamamoto was touring a nearby base at a small island called Balalay, had to be retransmitted in an army code, which Eric Nave had previously broken. So it was an Australian signals interceptor in one of those jungle tents I was telling you about, called Keith Falconer. I had the pleasure of meeting him before he died. He intercepted the code and passed it on to the relevant to his superiors, who then passed it on to the Americans, who found out where Yamamoto was going to be at a particular time, and that's the wreck of the plane of Yamamoto. We can still be found in the jungle of Guadalcanal. Now they are off to I don't know if that's the actual squadron, but anyway, that makes a good story. So now another thing I wanted to tell you about was going back to this picture here. So another way that Central Bureau was really able to help, and increasingly over the war, over 42, 43, experts came in from America, from Washington, really bolstered with like high-level mathematical expertise, as well as recruiting Australians. And one of the ways that could really help was when MacArthur wanted to take that. The Allies occupied the southern coast of New Guinea, while the Japanese had captured the northern coast. And MacArthur wanted to recapture that northern coast in an operation called Operation Cartwheel. He originally wanted to attack a town called WWII. It's on the map there, you can see it. But it was Central Bureau's advice, particularly traffic analysis advice, not even necessarily reading the messages. And they said WWII is very heavily defended. The Japanese had been sneaking in troops, and they'd set effectively a series of ambushes. And so it was because of the excellent intelligence that he got that he was able to leapfrog around WWII to the much more lightly defended Hollandia, a previous Dutch settlement, which was, met with very light resistance. And so one of the things I like about this, and in the next example, which is instead of capturing what was known as the Celebes, or now I think it's Halmaheras, is that right? And so there's an island at the top called Morotai, and again, through intelligence from the code breakers, they knew where the Japanese troops were and where they were not. And so one of the things that I really like about this is that high quality intelligence saved lives. And not that they were wanting to save the lives of Japanese troops, but it also happened to save the lives of Japanese troops because these head-to-head major clashes, these major battles that would be historically significant battles that we would still be reading about today, never actually happened. There was no Battle of WWII, right? There was no battle of for the Halmaheras. So this is just a map that I found in the archives of some of their. They had different patterns and maps for the different networks, radio networks, because that was important. So if they knew which radio network they were listening to, and they could tell possibly from what was called from the preamble to the messages, what we would call today metadata, then they would knew which units they were dealing with, and they could track them as they moved across the Pacific. Now, another interesting thing is that MacArthur and his General Aiken actually formed a secret unit out of Central Bureaus. Actually, these were Australian. There was an Australian unit and an American Signals unit, and they accompanied them on the invasion of the invasion of Leyte. They recaptured the Philippines because they were listening into the radio messages from nearby Japanese bases to find out if the fleet had been discovered, and if so, what was being done about it. So it made a difference. It mattered. And one other thing I should tell you about. I've got 1 minute. One other thing, very quick thing I should tell you about is that the Central Bureau broke a code called the Water Transport Code, which isn't even necessarily a military code. But it turned out to be extremely important because that was the code that the Japanese were using to transport troops around. And so Central Bureau was able to pass on what's known as noon positions because a key feature of communicating, the Japanese Navy communicating positions, was they'd say when a troop convoy or a ship was going to be at noon on a particular day. And so the Americans could send a submarine, go, thank you very much, send a submarine to that position and wait until noon on that particular day. So, look, they made a big difference, and it was a huge operation here in Brisbane, very little known, and they didn't mix with other troops, either Australian or American. They really kept to themselves. And it was its own little subculture, really. Central Bureau was a very interesting subculture. Not very military, though. They were pretty undisciplined, and they got in trouble whenever high-ranking officials would come and visit. And they didn't do their parades very often, and weren't very good at the parades and so on. So, but it is a fascinating story, and I really. The last thing that's the one in the from. That's where Frommel was based in Melbourne. Is that they took over some flats called Monterey. I can't tell you about these people, but this is very interesting too. It's basically this woman who's Australia's first female engineer. She ran a training school off her own money and her own, created a volunteer militia called the Women's Emergency Signalling Corps, and basically got them into, it basically then persuaded the Australian military to take them as the first women intake into the military. So now I just have to, since I've got 1 minute, I met many veterans from Central Bureau. They're all gone now, unfortunately. But I interviewed, I don't know how many I interviewed, but I ended up joining their Veterans Association and going on to a lot of events and meeting them. And they came to mean a lot to me. So anyway, this is just some of them too, so this is not all. And that's Gordon Gibson here. So anyway, that's all I've got. And there's Keith Balconer, who intercepted the Yamamoto message in his living room in rural Victoria. Okay. Wow.
Thank you very much, David. That was fantastic. Please take a seat. And Ethan, if you'll come up now, then I'll leave it over to you to finish. Ethan's going to talk about the exhibition and all the work you have to do to get one up.
to talk a little bit about the planning that went into the presentation, some of the items that are part of it today, and then also a little bit about at the end of some of the cultural value and some cultural shortcomings of these presentations as well. This here is a badge. Unfortunately, we don't have it today, but I thought it illustrated very nicely the 4 allies, the flag of each of the 4 allies that we are talking about today. Right, first off, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who helped this come together. Jack, as you heard, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but Brenda and Leela have been absolutely amazing in their willingness to contribute to this, and it's been an absolute pleasure working alongside them. Joe and Cody Campbell were the finders of the sword, and they very kindly lent it to us. Vic could not be with us today. They're up in Cairns watching a few tanks do some laps at the Army Museum. But they donated a lot of their collection, particularly items that were recovered at Camp Columbia. So very much from the sites we're talking about. India, my partner, who helped me put together all the wonderful didactics that you have seen, Ed, who helped photograph, and all of the other members of the team who helped move things and prepare things, and lots and lots of people contributed to this. The banners as well with the gear, so lots of people contributed to this. I had a bit of a curatorial brief going in. You obviously have to limit these things in some sort of way. So I prioritised material from World War II Brisbane. I put 1939 to 46. As many of you know, it took quite a while for troops to come home, and so there is some of that latent activity from the war going into 46 as well. I would include some secondary material with connections to Brisbane or some of the other materials. So in particular, you've maybe seen some of the photographs of number 18 Squadron that are taken up in the Northern Territory. That's a bit further than Brisbane, but it ties in with some of the other items that we have in our displays as well. And I wanted to represent the 4 allies as best I could. I think I've succeeded on 3 of them. And I have to apologise to the British that I wasn't able to get any material for them. And this is an example of the selection process of what I'm going through. So this is one of the items from my collection. It's a 1953 RAN Chief Petty Officer badge. You can tell it's from 53 because of the crown and the standing kellic. Fantastic, but unfortunately it's post-ASAL period. And here we have the Book of the WWII, all about the women's roles in the WWII, their pay rates, their daily life, absolutely fantastic. But it's entirely about their war in Britain and their role there. So nothing about Australia, so unfortunately had to be cut. I also had a bit of some thematic associations that I created. We had civilian experience in wartime Brisbane, Allied cooperation, life of the soldier, and the war against Japan. These aren't officially labelled, but perhaps when you're having a look at the box, you'll start to notice, for instance, that I have grouped objects together that fulfil this particular role. And now we're going to some of the objects. So of course we have the star of the show, which is our Dutch civil servant's small sword. As mentioned, it was recovered by Joe and Cody Campbell from Camp Columbia in what was basically a rubbish pit, a number of bottles and other items there. It was found in worse condition and has since been polished up. We noticed that the hilt is missing and would have very likely been inlaid with mother of pearl when it was in use. This particular sword was owned by a high-ranking civilian administrator at Camp Columbia. That is most likely Van Mook, who was the Lieutenant Governor for the NEI government in exile, or possibly his 2IC, which is Von der Plas, who was previously the Governor of, I think it was East Java, if I recall, and then when he evacuated, he became the 2IC, and since Van Mook was often away, sometimes essentially the leader of the NEI in government exile. Here we have a look at some more details. So here we have the head of Athena on the pommel. Of course, Athena being the goddess of war and wisdom, a very common motif throughout Western civilization. We've got 2 quillions here, highly decorative of course. This is made of brass, not something you're going to be using as a weapon of war. And here we have part of our guard. And this is where I must admit to a mistake here. This is the best photo I had prior to actually viewing it. And I squinted at this particular crest for many long minutes, trying to work out what way the lions are facing. Why? Because if the lions are facing towards the crest in the centre, that is the version of the Netherlands royal family's coat of arms that was introduced in 1907. And so that will give us a date that it was produced at least after 1907 in the 20th century. However, actually having it here today, and hopefully you can go and squint at the box, you can see that the lions are actually facing the viewer, which means that it is the precursor version of the coat of arms, which was introduced, I think it's 1877 or something, but certainly it actually makes it more likely a 19th century sword. I'll also mention, if I go back here, you can see that the blade is triangular. No idea why. This is a very interesting decision. Usually triangular weapons are designed to be very difficult to stitch up. Some of you may know that the Germans used triangular bayonets in the First World War. Why they decided on a triangular design for a ceremonial sword, I do not know, but it was never intended to actually be used in combat. And of course, this beautiful scabbard there is designed to accommodate that. It gives it quite a nice rounded shape. Here we have a comparison between our example and an example I found in an online database at swordsdatabase.com of a 19th century court short sword and our short sword here, small sword. You can notice pretty much all of the details are one for one. You've got the head of Athena, you've got almost the exact same floral design, the quillions have the same rounding with that floral design, and the exact same crest here as well. You'll notice we've got some etching in the blade here as well. A number of examples from the Low Countries from this period have this etching in the blade. I can't see any yet in our example here. Possibly that's just a factor of the corrosion that it's undergone after being interred in the ground. So this is very likely a 19th century sword, and you can see the beautiful inlaid mother of pearl hilt there. And these would have very likely been manufactured in the same facility.
I made these pictures only for you to give the size. If I'd known you would use it here, I would do it properly.
That's all right, Paul, that's all right.
Sorry,
I don't blame you. I don't blame you, don't worry. These things happen when you're putting an exhibition together, right? This is another item we have. This is our female relative badge. I assume that many of you have experience looking through the National Archives' personal records, personal service records, and have probably seen papers for the issuance of female relative badges. They were given to women who were the nearest relative of a serving male member in either the Royal Australian Navy, the Army, both CMF and AMF, and Air Force, if I recall. They had serial numbers on them when they were issued, and this corresponds to a particular National Archives file, which gave me the date of 1943 to 1950. So I know when this was produced, and also states it was produced by Amor Sydney, which was a jeweller that produced a number of different badges for the Australian government. We have here our Tudor crown on top, as was in use at the time, to the women of Australia around the edge, and one pip. So one pip means you had one relative. Some of these examples have, say, 4 pips on them. Because they're for the closest female relative, they are for wives and mothers usually, as compared to, say, sweetheart bracelets, which were more common for girlfriends and things like that. These had a lot of social value when they were introduced. On one hand, it is a display of the wearer, that they have someone they love who is away and who is fighting, potentially at risk of death during the course of the war. but it's also a show of solidarity for the war. As we saw in the previous presentation, lots of women have been engaged in code breaking, industry, a range of operations throughout the war, but there is still a latent social expectation that women should support the war effort by getting their family members and friends to enlist and to support them overseas. So for many women, this is both a display of pride in their own family and service, and also a display that they are supporting Australia in the war effort in a way that is socially acceptable at the time. Here we have our Australian Rising Sun badge. I'm sure you guys have seen many examples. This is our third pattern. You can identify it by the use of the Tudor crown here and the Australian Commonwealth Military Forces written in the scroll here. It was introduced in 1904 and it was phased out, I think it's 1953 is the later pattern, when the new monarch comes in. So this would have been issued to troops, Australian troops in the RAF, both in the First and Second World War. This particular example, however, was found at Camp Columbia by Vic, so we know it was of Second World War provenance. Now, what is the value of exhibiting this World War II material? Here I'm going to put on my archaeologist hat a little bit and talk about kind of the purposes behind such exhibitions. Firstly, you probably think of educational purposes, right? Having these didactics, having these images gives some idea of what's going on, some historical context, helps fill in some of the gaps we talked about today, or helps supplement some of the material and the content that others have talked about today. And it gives us an insight into the lives of past peoples. However, it is worth remembering that these objects have been removed from their archaeological context, and the manner in which they're displayed is a result of considered curation. So what does that mean? That means that when these things are found, they are found in a particular context, a particular place, a particular layer. This gives clues to their function, who they belonged to, where they might come from. For instance, where I mentioned that badge was from Camp Columbia, that gives us more context to allow us to date it, as opposed to just those traits, typological traits. This means that we're also getting a slightly skewed view of our war. So when we're looking at what is being educated upon, it's what material is accessible, what material is able to put together and what's relevant, but also think that there is gaps that are missing in this collection, and that this particular collection would never, or very unlikely, have ever been found in one place, right? This is a multitude of lives, multitude of experiences that have come together to form this. Such displays, they allow us to peer into the past. So this allows us to construct an internal experience of the war and reinforces emotional and cultural links to prior generations. So for most of us, we do not have a personal experience of the Second World War, certainly not being engaged in fighting in the Second World War. And so in order to try and form an internal picture or internal idea of what it was like, we use media like photographs that we have over there, like objects, in order to construct an internal vision. So we can look at some of our sites of photos up there, say of Camp Columbia, and we can begin to reconstruct the site in our own heads, which we unfortunately cannot continue to visit today, and therefore that starts to colour in our experience of the war, and therefore informs our perceptions of the experience of the soldiers who are engaged in that war as well. And it reinforces emotional and cultural links. Most of us have family who served in conflict, and by seeing material that is related to their service, even if it's not particularly their medals or their material, but similar material, helps to reinforce this connection to our personal family, but also a wider cultural generation. For instance, material like this can be used to reinforce the idea of the greatest generation and ideas like that, right? And they contribute to the construction and maintenance of collective memory, either reinforcing pre-existing narratives or challenging them. Collective memory here is a idea of society's collective interpretation and understanding of the war. So for instance, a particular aspect of collective memory might be the Brisbane line. It's very common to hear about it, despite the fact that it was never official military policy and never implemented to the idea often understood. And so in having material like this, either it can reinforce pre-existing narratives or it can challenge them as well. And that kind of brings me to the end. I'm not even going to go over the 15 minutes.
Very well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating. Yeah, thank you. So, have we any questions? Oh, lots of questions. Now, I'm going to hand it to someone who can hear you properly, because I have hearing aids which don't do a brilliant job. Paul, can I ask you, so, because I can't necessarily, unless they want to do it themselves, but it would be better if you...
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. David was talking about the Americans that were involved in intelligence, and he mentioned the Navy and the Air Force. But my late partner was with the US Marines in the field doing military intelligence in the, the Southwest, what do you call it?
Pacific.
Guadalcanal, somewhere down there.
With what unit? Was it with the radio squadrons mobile?
I think it was the 1st Marines or so. But I really don't know because he wouldn't tell me much about it.
It's signed the same document.
Be the Navy and the minutes.
Yeah, I can't answer that question for you.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to make people aware that it wasn't just the Air Force and the Navy, but the US Marines were involved also.
Oh, yes. All, yes.
But you mentioned that the Navy had a separate system.
The Navy, the Australian Navy and the Australian Navy and the US Navy had their own joint operation with nobody else included, and they were focused exclusively on the high-level Navy codes. All other Japanese codes were done by, well, the Central Bureau and also related sort of partner organisations in America. But Central Bureau was the biggest in terms of manpower.
And we've got inside information now from Andrew.
They can't talk about that. I didn't sign that. So some people certainly may be aware of this, but the United States Marine Corps is actually a sub-organization of the Navy. So it's actually in the, so we have our Defense Department, but that was an amalgamation after World War II. The Department of the Navy owns the Marine Corps.
Okay.
So for example, there are no Marine doctors or Marine medics. They're all Navy doctors and Navy medics who support the Marine Corps. So similarly, very, very likely in World War II, if the Marines weren't receiving signal support from the Navy, what they often do is they'll receive support from the Army. So if they're conducting tactical operations, something the Marines really hate to admit is that while they're really great at some things, it does take the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Army to do some things for the Marines that the Marines can't do for
Well,
themselves.
the only thing I know that he did is that he, with I guess 2 or 3 others, or maybe just 1 other, would go to islands that were occupied by the Japanese, and they would, subterfuge, I guess in the darkness, they would get into these islands and get close to the Japanese settlement for intelligence. He spoke Chinese, and he probably could also understand a bit of Japanese. I know they use the same alphabet, but that doesn't mean necessarily anything. The Dutch and the Germans use the same alphabet also.
Yeah, that's also what you were mentioning, David, yeah? That those units were infiltrated close to Japanese.
As close as they could get, and yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we also have these stories from the Timor and Ambon, yeah, where the forces were brought into, and that included also some Dutch forces or British because they understood the language, and they were then reporting back to I think the Central Bureau.
Not from Timor.
No. Okay.
No, you might be thinking of the, but maybe David Horner can help a bit out here, but you might be thinking of the Allied Intelligence Bureau.
Yes,
so
yes.
the Dutch actually, there was a Dutch intelligence organisation in Java called Karma 13, but the Dutch intelligence operations in Brisbane were not associated with Central Bureau. They joined an entirely different entity called the AIB, and the AIB were responsible for the coast watches, but also for the Z-Force and other sort of special ops operations. So, yeah.
FELO. Was it
Yes.
Okay, interesting. There were more questions. Simon.
I just wanted to ask what happens on the card, whether we're on Brisbane Street in Ascot, I can't find it on the map, and also Ethan, do you have any idea how that sword got lost?
Do you want to answer your question?
What was my question? What was the question for me?
Brisbane Street, Ascot.
Henry Street.
Henry Street in Ascot.
Henry Street.
Yeah, 21 Henry Street.
Right.
But also they had computers. They actually had IBMs imported. I didn't mention this, didn't have time. Imported from the United States that were installed. At first they were installed in the garage out the back, and then they were installed at the Ascot fire station. And they were basically at the start of the war. They were decrypting everything. They had just rooms of people, pencil and paper. So this arduous process of decrypting everything. And then they brought in these IBMs, and they could feed it all in with punch cards, and just industrialised processing of thousands and thousands of enemy messages at a time. And that was all happening in the fire station.
David, was there was a system, there was that secret system, IBM. There were only 2 in the world, or 3 in the world, 5 in the world, and one of them was in Brisbane. It has a name, Sigali?
Sigaba? Is that what
Yeah?
That's different. I think that's...
Six Alley, thank you.
Six Alley. That's not the same thing either,
No?
is it? No.
That's the equivalent of Typex.
Sorry?
That's the American equivalent of Typex.
Yeah.
Okay, it was nothing to do with the Central Bureau.
Yeah, the Central Bureau was actually the repository for all of these machines. So the intelligence coming in from other cryptographic centres, such as Hawaii, Melbourne, and other places, and Bletchley Park. It was coming to Central Bureau. They had so once they removed the computers, they had a little special section out the back in the garage where these machines were all operating again around the clock.
Yeah, right. Ethan, there was a question for you.
As for the sword, why it ends up in this rubbish pit with a bunch of bottles, I have no idea. It's a very good question. It's the obvious question to ask. One suggestion is that perhaps part of the site was bulldozed or just thrown out, in the wholemeal, and that the sword got caught up in it. But I would think that if you were throwing out the contents of the Lieutenant Governor's collection, you might just have a look at what's in there. So it is very unclear why this sword is discarded in this way. As you saw, it's in fairly good condition. The hilt is missing, but that doesn't seem like it would be a basis to just throw it away. So it's an interesting question, and brings into the life of this object. Material culture is of course a living thing, and it has a story, but we unfortunately do not know it.
When it was found, Joe told me that underneath was totally disintegrated wood and a bit of palmoor. Yeah. So that was still there when it was thrown away, but it was totally disintegrated. So he couldn't get that together.
My guess would be, if it was to posit a wild guess, it would be the end of the war, perhaps, because I don't know from Central Bureau and the other intelligence organisations, once the war finished, there was a wholesale cleaning out of stuff. Things, for instance, Central Bureau burned all their papers, and in a pyre at the racecourse that burned for days, and other things were thrown away. Whole operations were just basically, guys would just be told, go in and clear out that building, and they just have to take it all away. And so it's entirely possible that in the wholesale just dismantling of the infrastructure, a lot of it valuable things.
What about the fact that it couldn't have been taken back into the Netherlands East Indies because it's a weapon?
I wanted to say, in terms of
You
cognition,
shouldn't take weapons.
this is the major change between the mid-century and the late century. A significant factor like that is that when the shires in Brisbane amalgamated to Greater Brisbane, they destroyed their records as well. And now we're in the centenary, and we are horrified, you know, in the 21st century. But this is the way that people used to think. You know, they had no sense. But it's.
But this is not paper. This is a ceremonial sword. You know?
Yes. The thing is that, and this is the challenge for today in the 21st century, is that there is a part of the population that is deliberately, I think, hostile to historical activities. And it's true. It's true. I've been a historian now in my career over 30 years, and I know that there are decision makers in our society who are very hostile to the idea that we have to preserve our history.
What are all the questions? Anneke?
A question to Ethan about that sword. Have you tried looking at correspondence of Van der Plas? Because he was the owner, wasn't he?
He was a potential owner. We don't know definitively who.
Could be Van der Moot, Hubert van der Moot. So we've got a picture of the Lieutenant Governor of the Netherlands. That's the proper title?
Yeah.
So we've got a picture of him. And you know what, one of the things of course is, and that coming back to what I said earlier, we already, one of the ladies told me, I'm a researcher, I'm going to help you. Thank you. And so what we, and also I spoke to the lady from the National Archives and from the War Museum, and she told me, Robin van Dijk, she told me, she will tell you perhaps as well, the documents that she were looking at now, because for the symposium, were not opened any time after World War II.
Wow.
So there's a hell of a lot of information.
There's tons.
And Paul Jacques told me about Jakarta. There's a lot of information in Jakarta. There's the National Archives here. There is of course the information in the Netherlands, etc. So you know, once we get this momentum going and we get more people, we can start. We might find a picture of one of the authorities with the sword, etc. So there's interesting things to discover.
Things like that. I'm curator of the Milne Bay Memorial Library and Research Centre, and we have a function. Someone will come with Granddad's old thing. One of the things that turned up after a clearance, after someone had died, and it's copy 6 of the Bougainville After Action Report, complete with maps. And it was completed in July 1945. How many people would have read that one?
That escaped the burning on the racecourse.
No, it's absolutely true. If you dive into any historical topic in Australia, you start looking through. There's a lot of there's also a lot of archives too, not just the National Archives. There's little ones. You quickly start finding yourself reading things that possibly haven't ever been read since it's been archived. Which is kind of fun, but it's the amount of unexplored stuff.
We also have the Don Prime Ministerial Library archives at Curtin University.
Yes.
You know, which is a very relevant one as well.
I just have a quick question about the coast watchers. They had nothing to do with Central Bureau.
No, nothing to do with it. They were run by the Navy and by the Naval Director of Intelligence, Cocky Long, and he. But they were ultimately under the auspices of the Allied Intelligence Bureau that I was talking about earlier, the AIB. I didn't cover that in my book. I think I might have mentioned it in passing once or twice. Yeah, but it was a whole other story.
I think we're running out of time, but one quick question. No, thank you.
Thank you very much. A hand please for the